The ice had turned the whole world to glass. She lay in it, flat in a shallow fold of frozen grass, high on a Kansas hill, and she did not move. Below her, the prairie fell away for more than a mile, white and gleaming and silent. Somewhere down in that silence, a man was about to die in the next 90 seconds, unless she was still exactly who she had once been. The crosshair sat unmoving on the far shape. Her breath came slow and even. Freezing rain ticked against the hood of a jacket that was not hers, and through the glass, the target wavered in the cold like something seen from under deep water. In her ear, a young voice, tight with fear and contempt, said the words she had heard her whole life. She is just the scorer. She should not even be up there. She let it pass, the way you let the wind pass. She had been the scorer. She had been a great many things that no one ever wrote down. Her thumb found the safety, not to fire, to wait, to hold. On the ice below, the man who wanted her dead lifted his head, and she saw his face clearly, and something in her chest that had stayed shut for 9 years came open. "Nobody gets left," she said, so low the radio barely caught it. Then the wind shifted, and everything she had spent 9 years burying came up the hill to meet her. Days before this frozen hill, the sun was still out. The bus that brought her in smelled of diesel and old coffee, and when the door folded open, the wind came in first. It always did out here. It came off 1,000 square miles of tall grass with nothing standing in its way, and it went straight through the seams of a person and found whatever they were trying to keep warm. She had forgotten how honest that wind was. It did not care who you had been. It did not care what they had taken from you. It only pushed, steady and cold and forever. And a person either learned to lean into it or the prairie wore them down to nothing. She came down the steps slowly, a woman of 46, gray, coming in at her temples, a face the color of a weathered fence post. She carried one long, hard case and one canvas duffel and nothing else. She wore a field jacket so old and so mended that the green of it had faded to the color of dead grass, and there was a name tape sewn above the right breast pocket. It did not say her name. It said, Treadway. Nobody came to meet her. Nobody had been told to. This was Fort Renfrew, out in the Flint Hills, where the Army kept a range complex so wide that a man could stand at the firing line and never see the far end of it. They called the place Blue Stem. In summer, it was an ocean of grass that ran green all the way to the curve of the earth. Now, in the last hard week of winter, it was the color of ash and old gold, and the sky above it hung low and gray with the look of weather that had not arrived yet but was surely coming. She had orders in her pocket, folded, stamped, signed by someone whose name would mean nothing to the young men on that firing line. The orders said she was the control, the scorer, sent down from higher to watch the last week of exercise winter keep, to sit behind the shooters with a book and a watch and mark down who could truly do the thing and who only said they could. That was all the orders said. That was all she meant to let anyone see. Down on the line, 12 of them lay prone behind their rifles, and every last one of them was young enough to be her child. They were the final class of the season, the ones who had lived through the cold months to reach this week, and they carried themselves like men who had already won. She knew the walk. She had walked it once herself, a lifetime ago, before the walk got taken out of her. Their rifles lay long and dark against the pale grass, bolt guns built for reaching, the heavy-barreled M2010 with its big glass, and off on the left, a pair of the faster semi-automatic guns for the men who wanted to argue that quicker was the same as better. She could have told them it was not. She kept it to herself. She set her hard case down at the edge of the line, out of the way, and she watched. The wind was doing something dishonest, and she saw it before any of them did. Down the length of the long draw, the shallow valley that ran out toward the distant steel, the range flags stood stiff and clean from their poles, every one of them pointing the same direction, telling the same tidy story. Any young shooter would read those flags and trust them. But the flags lied. Down in the low grass of the draw, where the wind forgets to announce itself, the air was sliding the other way, folding back on itself in a slow, cold river that no flag on a pole could ever show you. You did not read that wind with your eyes. You read it with the back of your neck, and with 20 years of having been wrong. A young sergeant lay behind the center gun, and he was the one they all watched. He was maybe 28, and he was beautiful the way a young man is beautiful when nothing has taken anything from him yet. Broad through the shoulders, easy in his own hands, a smile that came quick and cost him nothing. The others bent toward him, the way grass bends toward the low sun. When he spoke, they laughed, a half-second before the joke arrived. His name was Calvert, Chase Calvert, the top of the class, and he knew it the way a man knows his own heartbeat. A boy came up the line toward her while she stood there at the edge of things. 19, maybe, with ears too big for his helmet and a way of ducking his head as though he was sorry to take up room. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee, and he held one out to her without being asked. "Ma'am," he said, "it is cold out. There is plenty more if you want it." She looked at the cup and then at him. It had been a long time since anyone on a firing line had handed her anything but a hard look. "Thank you," she said. His name tape said S-I-S-K. He grinned, as though she had given him something instead of the other way around, and he went back down the line with his own cup, and she held the warmth of hers in both hands and did not drink it yet. She only watched him go, this kind boy in a cold place, and for reasons she could not have said out loud, her chest tightened as she did. That was when Chase Calvert rolled off his gun and saw her. He took his time about it. He looked at the mended jacket, and at the gray in her hair, and at the paper cup, and at the long, hard case resting at her feet, and something moved across his handsome face that she had seen on 100 faces, and would see on 1,000 more before she was done. "You lost, ma'am," he said, and the whole line went quiet to listen. "The quilting circle meets in town. This here is a rifle range." A few of them laughed. Not the boy named Sisk. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence costs less than pride, and that she could not afford pride anymore. Chase walked over to her, unhurried, still smiling. He reached out, friendly, easy, and with 2 fingers he tipped the paper cup in her hands. Just enough, just so. And the coffee ran out over her wrist and down into the frozen grass and steamed there between them in the cold. "Careful," he said softly. "You want to watch your footing out here. It is a young man's ground." Then he turned his back on her and walked away, and the laughter went with him. And she stood there with hot coffee cooling on her wrist and her face as still as the far hills. The cadre came next. A senior sergeant, thick through the chest, a voice roughened by 20 years of shouting into wind. Ockley, his name was, and everyone on that range flinched a little when he spoke. He had watched the whole thing, and it had amused him. "You the scorer they sent us?" he said. He did not wait for the answer. He looked her up and down, the way a man looks over a truck he is thinking of not buying. "They send us a range widow in a dead man's coat. Sit somewhere. You will not get hurt, ma'am. My boys are working today." Range widow. She had been called far worse. She found a place at the edge of the line, on an ammunition can, turned up on its end, and she sat down and she opened her book and she began, quietly, to do the only thing she had come there to do. She began to watch. The shooting started, and it went badly, and only she and the wind knew why. The target was steel, set out with a long draw open toward the far ridge, better than 1,000 yards off, a plate that should have rung like a church bell for shooters this good. It did not ring. Round after round went out and kicked up frozen dirt to the left of it, or sailed off to the right into the grass, and the young men began to mutter about their scopes and their ammunition and the cold, the way shooters do when the truth is too plain to say aloud. The truth was the wind. The wind was lying to them, and they were believing it, because the flags told them a clean story, and the flags were wrong. Chase Calvert fired, and missed and swore under his breath, and dialed his scope, and fired, and missed again. The smile was gone from him now. He was not used to the world refusing him. There was one shooter on that line the others did not bend toward, a small, young woman at the far right end, prone behind her gun with her jaw set hard. Her name tape said, Sava. Where the men were loose and certain, she was tight and careful. And when she missed, which was often that morning, the cadre Sergeant Ockley made sure the whole line heard about it. She did not answer him. She just settled back down behind the gun and tried again, and missed again, and her hands had begun to shake, a little, from the cold and from being watched by men who had already decided what she was. The scorer set down her book. She did not touch a rifle. She did not raise her voice. She leaned a little toward the girl, close enough that only the girl could hear her, and she spoke 6 quiet words. Read the low grass, not the flags. The girl went still. The draw is running right to left, the older woman said, soft and level, as though she were only telling her the time of day. 8/10 of a mil into a wind you cannot see. Hold off the left edge of the plate. Trust it. Send it. The girl breathed out slow. She held where she had been told to hold, into empty air, into nothing at all, against everything her own eyes were screaming at her. She sent it, and a full second and a half later, from all that distance away, the steel rang. It rang across the frozen prairie like a bell at the end of the world, one clear, bright note that rolled up the length of the long draw and broke over the firing line. And for a moment, nobody said a single word. Ockley recovered first. Luck, he said, loud, so the boys would know exactly what to think. Blind luck. Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. But down at the far end of the line, an old man had been standing in the cold, with his hands folded behind his back, watching, and he was not looking at the girl at all. He was looking at the woman on the ammunition can, and he had gone the color of the winter sky. He was the oldest man on that range by 30 years. Retired now, a command sergeant major who had done his time and could not make himself leave behind the smell of gun oil and cold grass, so they let him come out and stand at the graduations and remember. Tibbets, his name was, Mose Tibbets. He had heard 10,000 wind calls in his long life. He had never heard that one out of any living mouth. He had only ever heard it from a ghost. The morning wore on, and the wind kept lying, and now and then the small young woman named Sava hit the steel when the men did not, because now and then she remembered to listen to the quiet voice from the ammunition can instead of the loud one from the cadre. Nobody else seemed to notice where the good calls were coming from. They were young, they were certain, and certain men do not look behind them. But the old man noticed. The old man could not stop looking. At the noon halt, when the shooters filed in for chow and the line emptied out, Mose Tibbets walked over to where the scorer sat alone, and he stood in front of her a long moment before he could make himself speak. When the words finally came, His voice was not steady. "I know that wind call," he said. "I have only ever heard one person in my life read a draw like that, and they told me 9 years ago that she was dead." She looked up at him. The wind moved the dead grass around them both. Far off, past the ridge, thunder that was not quite thunder muttered somewhere in the low grey, the sound of the weather that was still on its way. "A great many people are dead, Sergeant Major," she said. "Sit down. You look cold." He did not sit. He looked at the name tape sewn above her pocket, the one that said Treadway, and his old mouth worked, and something very close to fear came up into his eyes. "That is not your name," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." And she did not tell him whose it was. She picked her book back up, and she looked out at the range again. And after a while, the old man walked away with his shoulders bent, like a man carrying a great weight up a long hill. That night, the old man could not sleep. He sat in his truck in the dark lot, behind the range headquarters, with the heater running and a thermos he did not open, and he watched the first fine grains of ice begin to tick against the windshield, and he thought about a thing he had spent 9 years trying with all his might not to think about. 9 years ago, he had been a younger man, in a hot place a long way from Kansas, and he had sat at a field desk with a radio crackling and a form in front of him, and an officer had stood at his shoulder and told him what to write. He had written it. He had signed his own name to the bottom of it. He had listed good men as lost, as beyond saving, when he knew in his bones that somebody up on a ridge had been screaming into a radio that they were not lost at all, that she had them, that she was holding, that nobody had to be left behind. He had signed the paper that said they were left. And then, weeks later, when the survivors came walking home after all, and the story got told and retold, the story had a different shape than the truth. In the story, there was a brave officer who had brought his men out of the fire. In the story, there was no woman on a ridge. There was no name put to the shot that saved them. There was only the officer and his medal and his career rising up bright as a rocket into the night, and a single form filed away in a drawer with an old sergeant's signature on the bottom of it that no one on this earth would ever read again. He had told himself it was above his pay grade. He had told himself it was buried and gone, and none of it was his to carry. Now, it was sitting on an ammunition can at his own range, wearing a dead man's coat, reading the wind the way only one soul who ever lived had read it. And the storm was coming down out of the north, and the old man in the truck put his face in his two hands and did not lift it for a long time. The next morning, the ice was on everything. It lay thin and bright over the grass and the gravel and the barrels of the rifles, and it made the whole world crackle softly underfoot, and the young men laughed and slipped and called it a nuisance, and did not yet understand what it was. She understood. She had watched skies her whole life. This was not a nuisance. This was the front edge of something that was going to close its hand over this range and cut it off from the rest of the living world. And she felt the knowledge of it sit in her stomach like a cold stone. The schoolhouse at Bluestem was a low building of cinder block and old paint, and on the wall just inside the door, there was a board that the young men touched on their way past, the way other men touch a church. It was the record board, the longest confirmed first-round cold bore hit in the history of the school. 2,214 yards, one shot, made under fire, in a place the board did not name, on a day the board did not describe. Where the shooter's name should have been, there was only a single line of type that said the record belonged to an operation called Copper Line, and beneath that, the one word classified and nothing else at all. No name, no face, just the number, and the silence wrapped around it, and the awe of every young shooter who had ever walked past. Chase Calvert stopped there every single morning. She watched him do it. He would lay 2 fingers on the cold glass over that number and hold them there a moment, the way you would touch a photograph of someone you had loved and lost. And then he would go out to the line and try and fail to become the ghost who had made that shot. Whoever he was, Chase said one morning, to no one, to all of them, he was the finest that ever lay down behind a gun. And he did it for Copperline. He did it for the Colonel. He said the word Colonel the way a boy says the name of a father he is proud of. The scorer stood behind him in the doorway with her book beneath her arm, and she looked past his shoulder at the number on the wall, the number that had been the last true thing she ever did in this world. And her face did not change at all, but her hand, down at her side, closed slowly into a fist, and then opened again. And no one saw it but the old man, who saw everything now. She said nothing. She went back out into the cold. There was one more man on that range who did not belong, and she had marked him the first day. He wore the tan and grey of the contractors who ran the opposing force for the exercise, the men who played the enemy so the young shooters could learn how it felt to be hunted. And he did his job well and drew no eyes to himself. And that was exactly why she noticed him. He was lean and weathered and somewhere past 40, and he moved the way a man moves who has done this for real, in places with no flags and no scorers and no going home at the end of the day. But it was his eyes that she marked. When the young men laughed, his eyes did not. And when the Colonel's name came up, and out here it came up often, something went hard and flat and still behind his face, like a door quietly closing in a house where something terrible had once happened. Once, across the whole width of the range, his eyes found hers and held them a moment too long. 2 people who were pretending to be less than they were. 2 people carrying something heavy up the very same hill from opposite sides of it. Then he looked away, and she looked away, and neither of them said one word, and the ice kept falling, and the weather kept closing its hand. Not everyone who had come out to Blue Stem that week had come to watch boys shoot. There was a woman among the visitors, 40 or so, in a plain grey coat, who kept to the edges the way the scorer kept to the edges, and who carried herself with the flat, unhurried patience of a person whose whole job is to notice things and say nothing. She wore an identification badge on a lanyard, turned around backward so the face of it lay hidden against her chest. She never once watched the shooting. She watched the people. And more than once, when the scorer looked up from her book, she found the woman in the grey coat already looking back at her with an expression that gave away exactly nothing. Then the woman would turn, in no hurry at all, and drift away into the cold, and the ice would go on falling, and nothing at all would be said. They heard the helicopter before they ever saw it. It came in low out of the grey from the east, beating the cold, heavy air flat beneath it, and every young man on that firing line sat up straighter as it settled onto the pad behind the schoolhouse, and the rotors moaned and wound down to stillness. The word went along the line like current down a wire. He was here. The Colonel was here. The graduation had been moved up ahead of the storm, and the man himself had flown in to watch his last class of the season shoot. Colonel Wesley Prentice stepped down out of the aircraft the way a man steps out onto a stage he knows he owns. He was 58, and he wore every year of it well. Silver at the temples. Tall. A jaw like the squared edge of a shovel. And there on his chest, riding among the ribbons, the pale blue of the highest regard the nation gives, the medal from the Valley, the medal from Copperline, the one that had made him what he was. The young men looked at him the way Chase looked at the number on the wall. Ockley snapped to attention so fast he very nearly went down on the ice. Even the wind seemed to stand aside and give the great man room to pass. He walked the line, and he shook the cold hands, and he said the right things to each of them. And then, because there was press coming for the graduation and a general flying in behind them, and because he had built an entire life out of saying it, he stopped in the middle of the firing line where every one of them could hear, and he told them the thing he believed. "Gentlemen," he said, "soon some of you will pin on a badge that means the mission comes first. Before your comfort, before your fear, before the man lying in the grass beside you. Remember it. The mission does not stop for one man. It never has. It never will." The young men drank it down like cold water on a hot day. And then Colonel Wesley Prentice turned, still smiling, to nod toward the schoolhouse and the graduation party gathering there, and his eyes crossed the far edge of the firing line, and they landed on a gray-haired woman sitting alone on an ammunition can in a dead man's coat. And the smile came off his face like paint peeling off a wall. For one long second, the whole cold world seemed to hold still around them. The wind dropped. The ice stopped ticking. The young men noticed nothing at all. But the old sergeant major noticed, and the lean contractor with the hard, flat eyes noticed, and the woman on the can looked back at the great colonel without moving and without one flicker of fear, and the color drained slowly out of him until his face was the same dead gray as the sky pressing down over the range. He crossed to her fast, and lo, his voice pitched down for her ears and no one else's, and for just a moment the thing that lived underneath all those medals came up into his eyes where she could see it. "You were relieved," he said. "You are finished. You do not exist here." She looked up at him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, and it was steady, and it did not give him one single inch of ground. "I have orders, Colonel," she said. "Same as you." His jaw worked. He wanted her gone. She could see him already reaching for the power to make it so. The phone call, the quiet word in the right ear, the machine that had erased her once before without leaving a mark. But the orders folded in her pocket had come down from a place that even he could not reach in a single winter afternoon, and they both knew it, and it was eating him alive. "This is my range," he said. "I know," she said. "I remember when it was your valley, too." Something crossed his face then that was very close to terror. He straightened himself up to his full height. He put the smile back on, because there were young men watching and a legend to protect, and a star waiting for him just over the horizon, and he walked away from her toward the schoolhouse with his back straight and his hands steady and his head high. But she had seen it. Whatever he had buried 9 years ago in a hot valley on the far side of the earth, he had just felt it turn over in the ground beneath his polished boots. Overhead, the low gray belly of the sky finally split open, and the freezing rain came down harder out of it, fine and bright and merciless, and it began to lay a thin, shining shell of ice over the grass and the rifles and the record board and the whole wide, silent range. The storm had come at last to Blue Stem, and the woman in the dead man's coat sat alone on her ammunition can in the falling ice and watched the colonel walk away from her, and thought of a promise she had made to a dying man on a ridge on the far side of the world. Hold the line. Get them home. Do not let them write us off. She had kept only half of it, and she had kept it in silence for 9 long years. She did not yet know that before the storm was done, she would be lying on a frozen hill with a man's life resting in her crosshair and a boy's frightened voice in her ear, calling her nothing at all. She only knew that the past had finally come, walking up the hill to find her, and that it had come dressed as a hero. By the second morning, the ice owned everything. It hung from the wire and the flagpoles in long, clear teeth. It sealed the doors of the trucks and glazed the barrels of the rifles and turned the wide, tall grass of blue stem into a field of broken glass that cracked and sang beneath every boot. The sky had come all the way down to the ground. A man standing at the firing line could no longer see the far ridge where the steel waited. He could see maybe 400 yards into the falling white, and after that, the world simply stopped, as though nothing beyond it existed at all anymore. Any honest range would have shut down that morning. This one did not. Because Colonel Wesley Prentice had a graduation coming and a 2-star general already in the air and a row of cameras on the way to watch his last class of the season become the thing he had made them. And Colonel Wesley Prentice did not let weather write his story for him. He never had. "We shoot," he said, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with the ice ticking on the roof above his head. "We shoot today. We graduate on schedule. The mission does not stop for a little bad weather. It does not stop for anything." The young men cheered him. Of course they did. The woman they called the scorer stood at the back of the room with her book beneath her arm, and she looked out the window at a sky she had been reading her whole life, and she knew the thing the young men did not. This was not a little bad weather. This was the kind of storm that closes the roads and grounds the helicopters and cuts a place off from the rest of the living world for a night or a day or longer. This was the kind of storm that takes away every safety net a person leans on out here and leaves only the ones who are actually standing on the ground. She said nothing. She had been saying nothing for 9 years. It was the thing she was best at now. They tried to shoot, and they failed, and the failing made them cruel. The steel would not ring. The wind under the ice was a living thing, coiling down the long draw in ropes and eddies no young man could see, and round after round vanished into the white and struck nothing at all. Chase Calvert fired until his barrel steamed and his knuckles bled from the cold, and he did not hit, and something in the beautiful certain face of him began to crack down the middle. The general was coming. The cameras were coming. And the golden boy of the class could not hit a barn. He came off his gun, and he found her at the edge of the line, the way a hurt animal finds something smaller to bite. "You think you can do better, quilting lady?" His voice carried now. He wanted it to carry. "You have been sitting there 3 days with your little book, judging men who do the work. How many of these shooters are yours, huh? How many belong to you?" She looked at him for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was low and even, and it went all the way down the silent line. "None of them are mine," she said. "I just keep score." "That is right," Chase said, and he smiled that broken smile. "You keep score. We hold the line. So sit down and keep score and let the men work." Ockley laughed. Prentice, standing in the schoolhouse door, did not. Prentice watched her the way a man watches a fuse he thought he had already cut, and there was something behind his eyes that was not amusement at all. It was fear, wearing a colonel's face, and it was curiosity. He wanted to know if she was still the thing he had made her 9 years ago. He wanted to watch her sit down. So he let it happen. He let the boy push. And that was the first mistake Wesley Prentice made that day, though it would not be the one that killed anybody. "Give her a rifle," the colonel said quietly from the door. "Let the scorer shoot." The line went still. She did not take one of their rifles. She walked to the edge of the mats, where her long, hard case had sat untouched for 3 days, and she knelt down in the ice beside it, and she opened it. Inside, on a bed of foam gone soft with years, lay a rifle that was nothing like theirs. It was older. It was hand-built. A bolt gun with a heavy fluted barrel and a stock worn pail where a person had carried it 1,000 miles, chambered for the big point 300 Magnum that reaches out past where young men believe the world ends. And folded beneath it, the color of dead grass and winter stone, lay a ghillie she had sewn with her own hands across more nights than she could count. She did not put on the ghillie. There was no time and no need. She took out the rifle, and her hands moved over it the way a mother's hands move over a child, checking, knowing, and the young men watched her do it, and the laughter died in their throats one by one, because there is a way a person handles a rifle that cannot be faked, and every shooter on that line knew it when they saw it. She lay down in the ice. She did not dial the scope. She did not ask the distance. She lay behind the gun, and she went utterly still, and she read the storm the way the rest of them read a page, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath and wait for her. "Wind is lying to you," she said, very quietly, to no one. "It always lies when it snows. You do not read the flags, you read the ground." Then she sent one round into the white. For a second and a half, there was nothing but the wind. And then, from all that impossible distance out in the storm where no one else could even see the target, the steel rang. One clear, bright note came rolling back up the long draw through the falling ice, and it broke over that firing line like the voice of something none of them had ever met before. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Chase Calvert stared out into the white where the ring had come from, and then he stared down at the gray-haired woman lying in the ice at his feet, and his whole face had come apart. "Who are you?" he whispered. She worked the bolt. She caught the spent brass in her palm, warm and smoking, and she closed her hand around it and got to her feet, slow, an old ache in her knees. "Vestal," she said. "That was all. I keep score." She put the rifle back in its case, and she closed the lid, and she walked back to her ammunition can and sat down and picked up her book, and behind her, the young men stood in a silence that had teeth, because every one of them had just watched a legend put on a coat and pretend to be nobody, and they did not yet understand what they had seen. But Wesley Prentice understood, and down in the cold under the medals, the buried thing turned over again. He came to her while the others filed in for the noon halt, and he crouched beside her ammunition can so the words would fall no farther than her ear. His smile was gone. His voice was a thing scraped down to the bone. "You made your point, Sergeant Vestal," he said. "You always could shoot. But shooting was never your problem, was it? Your problem was that you never learned to sit down when a better man told you to. Look where it got you. Look what you are now, a scorer in a dead man's coat. Still nobody. Good." He stood up before she could answer. He straightened his uniform. He walked away toward the schoolhouse where the boys and the cameras were, a hero going back to his admirers, and he did not know that she was looking at his back and hearing another voice under his, a voice from 9 years ago on a burning ridge, saying almost the very same words. She did not answer him. She held the warm brass in her fist until it went cold. The demonstration was set for that afternoon, storm or no storm, because the general had landed and would have to be flown out before the roads iced shut, and Prentice would not lose his moment. The plan was simple, and it was for the cameras. The class would fire a volley at a bank of steel silhouettes downrange, altogether a wall of sound and hits to show the visiting general what Bluestem could make of a boy. But the ice had knocked half the silhouettes flat, and before the demonstration could go, the targets had to be reset by hand, downrange, out in the white where no one could see. They sent a detail out to do it. 4 young soldiers with a truck and a coil of rope, walking out into the storm to stand the steel back up. One of them was the boy named Wyatt Sisk, who had carried her a cup of coffee on her first cold morning because it was the kind thing to do. She watched them go out into the white and disappear. Then she watched the clock, and she watched the sky, and she felt the whole thing go wrong before it went wrong. The way you feel a floor give way half a heartbeat before it drops. The detail was slow coming back. The ice had frozen the target frames, and the young men out there were fighting them with numb hands, and the minutes stretched, and up in the control tower, the schedule that Wesley Prentice worshipped was slipping, with a 2-star general checking his watch and a storm eating the daylight. And so the colonel made the second mistake, the one that killed somebody. The word came down from the tower, in the colonel's own flat, certain voice, riding the range net for every station to hear. The demonstration would proceed on time. The downrange lane was called clear. The firing line was cleared hot. She heard it. She was the control. She had a radio on her hip, the scorer's radio, a voice on that net if she chose to use one. And she knew the way she knew her own name, that the lane was not clear, that the detail had not come back, that Wyatt Sisk was still out there in the white among the steel, on his knees, fighting a frozen frame with bleeding hands, exactly where a wall of rifle fire was about to go. To stop it, she had to key that radio and override a colonel in front of his general and his cameras. She had to stand up and take command of a range that was not hers and put herself back in the one seat she had sworn on a dead man's grave she would never sit in again. Because the last time she had done that, the last time she had held the line when a colonel said, "Let go," a good man had died beside her, and they had taken her whole life away for it. Her thumb found the radio, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the length of a single held breath, the old wound closed her hand. Not my call, not my range, not my line. I just keep score. 1/2 second, that was all it was. And in that 1/2 second, the firing line went hot, and a wall of sound rolled out across the frozen ground. And out in the white, where the steel stood, a boy who had once handed a stranger a cup of coffee because it was the kind thing to do, went down into the ice and did not get up. The volley stopped. The silence after it was the worst silence she had ever heard, and she had heard some. She was already running. She ran out into the white, with her old knees screaming and the ice tearing at her hands, and she found him among the fallen silhouettes with the snow going pink beneath him. And she got down and she held him. And the boy named Wyatt Sisk looked up at her with a child's confusion in his face, as if to ask her how this could be, as if she of all people would know. And then the light went out of him there in her arms, in the falling ice, and he was gone. She knelt in the snow, and she held a dead boy she had not saved. She did not weep. She had lost the ability a long time ago. She simply knelt there with him while the ice came down and covered them both. And somewhere very far away, she heard shouting and boots and a colonel's voice already beginning to build the story that would keep this from touching him. And in the cold center of her, a small flat voice she had spent 9 years believing said the thing she could not run from. She had had the radio. She had had the voice. She had had the knowing. And she had held her tongue for 1/2 second to protect herself exactly the way a colonel had held his tongue on a ridge to protect his timeline. She had become the thing she hated most in all the world. She had left someone. "None of them are mine," she had told the boy. "I just keep score." Now the score started at 1. They came for the cadre first, the way they always come for the man closest to the ground. Sergeant Ockley had signed the range safety card that morning. His name was on the paper that said the lane was cleared and the fire could go. And within the hour, there were officers with clipboards and a colonel with a grave, sorrowful face, explaining to the visiting general that a tragic error had been made at the sergeant level, that the cadre had cleared a lane he should not have cleared, that the army would of course investigate, that no blame attached to the command. Ockley stood in the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and his face grey as ash, a hard man watching 20 years of service turned into a shovel to bury a colonel's mistake. The scorer walked in out of the storm, with a dead boy's blood frozen on the front of her coat, and she looked at Ockley, and then she looked at the colonel, and she understood exactly what she was seeing. She had seen it before. She had been it before. She crossed to Ockley. She spoke low, so only he could hear. "You did not clear that lane," she said. It was not a question. Ockley looked at her, and something broke behind his hard eyes. "I signed it at 0600, he said hoarse, "for the morning relay. I never cleared it hot for that volley. That call came off the tower net. That call came from him." "I know," she said. "I heard it. It came from the colonel." The big man stared at her. 3 days he had ridden her, called her a widow, called her nothing. And here she stood in a boy's blood, telling him the one thing that could save what was left of his name. "Why would you help me?" he said, "after what I said to you?" "Because they are going to write you off," she said, "the same way they wrote off better men than either of us. And I am done watching that happen quiet." She held his eyes. "There is a message log in that tower. Every call, time-stamped, by station. They can burn a paper card. They cannot burn the log. Get it. Get it before he does." And Hap Ockley, who had spent 3 days despising her, nodded once, like a man taking an order he had been waiting his whole life to be given. Out at the edge of the range, past the trucks, past the lights, a lean, weathered man in contractor tan stood alone in the falling ice and watched them carry the boy's body in. He had watched all of it. He had watched the colonel push the schedule. He had watched the lane go hot. He had watched a 19-year-old die in the snow so a man with a star coming could keep his cameras happy. And something that had been winding tighter in him for 9 years, one turn at a time, came to the end of its travel and stopped. He did not know yet who the grey-haired woman in the dead man's coat was, but he knew what the colonel was. He had always known. He reached into the cab of his truck and put his hand on a long, hard case of his own, and he looked toward the schoolhouse, where they were even now setting up chairs for a graduation, and his hard, flat eyes did not blink. 9 years he had waited for the right room. The colonel had just built it for him. That night, the storm closed its fist. The roads glazed over, and the last vehicle that tried them slid into a ditch and stayed there. The helicopter that should have carried the general home sat frozen to its pad. The phone lines sagged and snapped under the weight of the ice, one after another, and the range net crackled and went to static, and Bluestem drifted away from the rest of the world like a boat cut loose from its mooring. There was no one coming. There was no calling out. There were only the people standing on the ground. She sat alone in the dark of the empty schoolhouse with the dead boy's coat still on her, and her thumb found the name tape sewn above the pocket, the one that said Treadway, and she ran it back and forth across the worn letters the way she had 10,000 nights, and the past came up out of the ground at last and took her all the way back. 9 years, and a ridge above a village called Sethraz, and heat instead of ice. 7 of theirs pinned in a dry wash below, cut off, bleeding, and a convoy of important men that could not be made to wait. The order came up the net to displace, to pull back, to leave the 7 where they lay, because the timeline mattered more than they did. She had a spotter beside her then, a steady, quiet man whose name was sewn on the coat she wore now. And when the order came to run, the 2 of them had looked at each other, and neither of them had run. She had stayed on that ridge, and she had held the line with the big 50 and a bolt gun, one impossible shot after another, 2,000 yards and more, keeping the enemy off those 7 boys hour after hour, while the important men drove on. Her spotter had called her wind and her range, and then he had risen up to drag a wounded boy out of the open, and a round had found him, and he had gone down. 6 of the 7 came home alive. 1 did not, a boy of 19 who died in the wash, and her spotter died an hour later with his own field jacket wrapped around another bleeding boy to keep the life in him, a golden-haired 19-year-old he had never met. With the last of himself, he had pressed her hand and said the only 3 things that mattered. Hold the line. Get them home. Do not let them write us off. Then he was gone, and the ridge was quiet, and far below her, the boy in her spotter's coat was still breathing. She had held the line. She had gotten them home, but she had let them write it off. She had let a colonel take the shot and the medal and the story. She had let them seal her name in a drawer and send her away, and she had gone silent for 9 years because fighting had already cost her everything she had. 2 promises kept, 1 broken every single day. She opened her eyes in the dark. The old man was standing in the schoolhouse doorway. Mose Tibbets came in slow out of the storm, and he halted before her with his hat in his hands and tears standing in his old eyes, and he said the name at last. "Bellwether," he said. "That was your call sign, on the ridge. They struck it off every record so the colonel could have Copperline for himself. That shot on the wall out there, 2,214 yards. Everybody thinks it belongs to him." His voice broke. "It belongs to you. I signed the paper that said those boys were lost. I knew you had them. I knew, and I signed it, and I have carried it for 9 years." She looked up at the old man who had helped bury her, and she found she had nothing in her but tired. "One of those boys we brought home," she said quietly, "is asleep in the barracks, 50 yards from here. He has a coffee cup with his name on it and a smile that costs him nothing, and he touches that record on the wall every morning like it belongs to a father he never met." She stood up, slow, in the dead man's coat. "I did not come here to be seen, Sergeant Major. I came to watch over that boy, because a better man than me died keeping him breathing, and it was the last thing he asked." That was the moment the schoolhouse door blew open behind them, and the ice came in, and a man in contractatan stepped through it with a rifle in his hands. The graduation had already begun in the big drill bay next door. The general was there, and the cadre, and the cameras with their patient lights, and the whole last class in dress uniform, and Colonel Wesley Prentice at the podium with the medal on his chest, telling them once more about the mission that never stops for one man. And into the middle of that bright, warm room, the man in tan walked out of the storm and raised his rifle and put the whole ceremony on its knees. His name was Reuben Fessler. He said it out loud, so the cameras would have it. He was 40 years old, and he had a dead brother, and he had come a long way through a lot of years to stand in this room. He moved the general and the cadre and the boys against the wall, and he did it without shouting, which was worse than shouting, and then he turned the rifle on the one man he had come for, and he made the whole world listen. 9 years ago, you left 7 men in a wash to die, Reuben Fessler said to the colonel, "so you would not be late." 6 of them came home because a woman on a ridge would not run. One of them did not come home. His name was Seth. He was my brother. He was 19. His voice did not shake. That was the terrible thing. You put a medal on your chest for what she did, and you called those boys lost, and you buried her alive. And now you are going to stand in front of these cameras, and this general, and these children, and you are going to say it. You are going to say what you did. The colonel's face had gone the color of the ice on the windows. And then Wesley Prentice, cornered, terrified, a hero with nothing left under the medals, did the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He looked past the desperate armed man to the frozen radio and the cut phone and the storm sealing them all in together, and he reached for the cold, certain voice that had never once failed him, and he gave the order he had given on a ridge 9 years before. "Nobody move on him," the colonel said, low and fast, to the cadre along the wall. "We do not negotiate with him. We wait him out. He is one man, and the mission is these cameras and that general getting out of here clean." His eyes swept the terrified boys against the wall, the hostages, the collateral, and something in them had already done the arithmetic. If it comes to it, the others are acceptable. The others are acceptable. In the dark of the schoolhouse next door, the woman in the dead man's coat heard the muffled shape of those words come through the wall, and she knew them because she had heard them before, on a ridge, in the heat, from the same mouth. Some things do not change. Some men only ever do the one thing. She stood in the doorway, 46 years old, grey in her hair, a boy's frozen blood on the coat of a man who had died, telling her to hold the line. Through the wall, a desperate brother was counting down to something terrible, and a colonel was writing off a room full of children to save himself, and a whole snowbound world sat cut off with no one coming. There was no one left to hold the line but her. She reached down and she took the field jacket by the collar and she settled it square on her shoulders, the coat of the best man she had ever known. And for the first time in 9 years, her hands did not shake. Before that long night ended, she would be lying on a frozen hill with a man's life in her crosshair. Now, she picked up the long, hard case, and she walked toward the sound of the guns. She did not go through the front door with her rifle up. That was not how you held a line. That was how you lost one. She went to the cadre room first, in the dark, moving the way the ice had taught her to move. And she found the old man and the big sergeant already there. Mose Tibbets stood by the window with a folded paper finally out of his pocket after 9 years, and it shook in his old hand. Beside him, Hap Ockley held a printout, still warm from the tower, every call on that range net, time stamped by station. The truth of who cleared that lane, Hart, laid out in black and white. They looked at her, an old man and a hard man, and they were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. And she understood, standing there in a dead man's coat, that she had spent 9 years running from exactly this. Somebody had to hold the line. There was no one left to do it but her. "Sergeant Major," she said, "you still know how to work a public address system." Tibbets nodded. "When I tell you, you put that paper on every speaker in this building, and you read it out loud, and you do not stop no matter what he says." She turned to Ockley. "You get the boys out, quiet, out the back, into the field house, and you keep them there. Whatever happens in that room, those children go home tonight." Ockley looked at her a long moment. Then he came to attention. This man who had called her a range widow only days before, and it was the straightest he had stood in 20 years. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. She did not wave him off. She had earned the right to give that order a long time ago on a ridge, and she was done pretending she had not. The golden boy found her at the back door. Chase Calvert stood there in his dress uniform with Wyatt Sisk's blood still on the cuff where he had tried to help carry the body in, and the certainty was gone out of him entirely now. He had watched a stranger make a shot no man on that line could make. He had watched a boy die for a colonel's schedule. He did not understand any of it yet, but he understood that the woman he had mocked was the only person in this frozen place who was not afraid, and he did the bravest thing he had done all week. He asked to come. "I can spot," he said. "Whatever you are going to do out there, let me spot for you." She looked at him a long time, at the easy shoulders that had gone hard with grief, at the face of a boy she had watched breathe on a mountainside 9 years ago and had watched from the shadows ever since. And she thought that of all the ways this night could break her open, this was the one she had never let herself imagine. "Bring your glass," she said, "and do exactly what I tell you." They went out into the storm together. The drill bay stood at the end of the row, a great steel building with its vehicle doors rolled half open to the night, and inside it the lights burned warm and yellow over a graduation that had turned into a hostage. She did not go toward the doors. She went up. She climbed the low hill behind the range with her old knees screaming and the ice tearing at her hands, and she went to ground in a shallow fold of frozen grass 1,100 yards out, and she built her position the way she had built 10,000 of them, slow and sure, elbows down, cheek welded to the stock. Chase lay in beside her with the spotting scope and did not say a word. Below them, through the open bay doors, in a rectangle of warm light in the middle of all that dark, she could see it all. The general against the wall, the cadre, the cameras with their patient red lights still burning, still recording, because no one had dared to turn them off. And in the center of the floor, Reuben Fessler, with a rifle in his hands and 9 years of grief in his shoulders, and Colonel Wesley Prentice on his knees before him at the podium where an hour ago he had been a hero. She keyed the little radio she had taken off the scorer's belt, and she found the frequency the contractors used, and she spoke into the storm to a man she had never met who had come here for the same reason she had. "Reuben Fessler," she said. Down in the light, the man's head came up. "You do not know me," she said, "but I know your brother. I know Seth. I was on the ridge above Sethraz 9 years ago, the day they told those 7 boys to lie down and die so a convoy would not be late. I was the one who did not run." The whole world seemed to go still around her words. "I held that line as long as I had blood to hold it," she said. "I brought 6 of them home. I could not bring Seth. He was too far out, and there were too many guns. And I was only one woman with 1 rifle. And I have carried that boy up every hill I have climbed for 9 years." Her voice did not break, but something underneath it did. "I never wrote him off, Reuben. Not for 1 second. The man kneeling in front of you did that. Not me, never me." For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then Reuben Fessler began, silently, to come apart. The rifle in his hands dropped a few inches and a few inches more, and the terrible steadiness that had held him upright for 9 years went out of him all at once, the way it goes out of a man when the thing he has carried alone is finally lifted by another pair of hands. He had not come to kill children. He had come because there was no other room in the world where anyone would say his brother's name and mean it. And now a voice out of the storm had said it and meant it, and he was just a grieving man in a cold building with a gun he no longer wanted to hold. "They said he flinched," Reuben said into the radio, and his voice was the voice of a boy. "They said my brother broke and ran and got himself killed. They gave that colonel a medal, and they buried my brother A coward. Your brother did not flinch, she said. Your brother held his ground in that wash until the last light went out of him, and he did it because the man beside him would not leave either. I watched it through this same glass. Seth Fessler was the bravest of all of them, and I will stand in front of any camera in that room and say so. The rifle came all the way down. Reuben Fessler let the hostages go. He told them to walk, and they walked, the general and the cadre filing out into the cold with their hands still up, and he stood alone in the middle of the bright, empty floor with the rifle hanging from one hand and the cameras still burning, and his whole ruined face turned up toward the storm, as if he could see her out there in it. It was over. She had held the line, and no one else had died, and the truth was standing in the light with the red lights of the cameras on it, and for the first time in 9 years, the weight came off her chest and she could breathe. That was when Chase Calvert, lying in the ice beside her with the spotting scope in his hands, finally understood. He had been staring down at that empty, bright floor, at the record he had touched every morning of his life, made flesh 1,100 yards below him, and the pieces had been falling into place one by one. The wind call no one alive could make. The shot on the wall marked only copper line. The gray-haired woman in a coat that was not hers, watching him, always watching him, from the edge of every room. And now, the words coming out of the radio in her quiet, even voice. The ridge, the 7 boys, the one who would not leave. He turned and looked at her, and his voice, when it came, was very small. "You are Bellwether," he said. "You made that shot. You are the ghost on the wall." "Yes," she said. She did not look away from the glass. "And that coat." He was looking at the name tape now, at the letters he had walked past 100 times. Treadway, the man who... He could not finish it. "His name was Eli Treadway," she said softly. "He was my spotter. He was the best man I ever knew. And 9 years ago, in a dry wash on the far side of the world, he took off that coat and he wrapped it around a bleeding boy of 19 to keep the life in him. And he stayed there in the open covering that boy until a round found him, and he died with his hand on that boy's chest." She finally turned her head and looked at Chase Calvert, at the man that boy had grown into, at the face she had kept breathing across 9 years and 1,000 miles. "You were the boy, son. You have been alive for 9 years because a man you never met gave you his coat and his life, and because I would not run when they told me to. I did not come here to be a scorer. I came here to watch over you." It was the last thing he ever asked me. Chase Calvert put his face down into the frozen grass, and his shoulders shook, and out of him came the sound of a man meeting, all at once, every good thing that was ever done for him in the dark that he never knew about. She let him have it. There was time. There was, for one moment, time. And then down in the light, Wesley Prentice got up off his knees. She saw it through the glass before Chase did. She saw the colonel rise, and she saw him understand, the way a cornered animal understands, that a living Reuben Fessler and a living Bellwether meant the end of everything he was. The medal, the star, the story, 9 years in the building. All of it gone the moment those cameras carried the truth out of this valley. And she watched Wesley Prentice reach down to the security officer lying bound at the edge of the room and take the pistol from the man's holster. And she watched him turn toward the unarmed, grieving man standing alone in the light. And she understood what he was going to do. He was going to kill Reuben Fessler. He was going to shoot down an unarmed man in front of the cameras and call it heroism, call it stopping a terrorist, call it saving them all. He was going to write off one more human being to save himself, exactly the way he had done it on the ridge, because it was the only thing Wesley Prentice had ever truly known how to do. And he stepped out through the open bay doors into the falling ice to do it, out into the open, out onto the frozen ground, where the light spilled yellow across the white, so that the cameras inside would have their angle, so the world would see the hero end the threat. He stepped out onto the ice below her hide, 1,100 yards away, and he raised the pistol at the back of a broken man's head. She settled her cheek to the stock. The crosshair sat unmoving on the far shape. Her breath came slow and even. Freezing rain ticked against the hood of a jacket that was not hers, and through the glass the man wavered in the cold like something seen from under deep water. In her ear, on the range net, a young officer's voice cut in, tight with fear, trying to take control of a thing that had already left his hands. "Get that woman off the net. She is just the scorer. She should not even be up there." She let it pass, the way she had let it pass her whole life. Her thumb found the safety, not to fire, to wait, to hold, because she could kill him. That was the thing no one down there understood. At 1,100 yards, in a howling storm, she could put a round through Wesley Prentice's spine before the sound of it ever reached him, and no jury on earth would call it anything but a rescue. And 9 years of what he had done to her could be answered in a single breath. It would be so easy. It would be so nearly just. But a dead Wesley Prentice was a hero forever. A dead colonel was a folded flag and a name on a building and a lie that could never be pulled back out of the ground. And a woman who put a bullet in a man's back, even that man, even for that reason, was no longer holding any line worth the name. She had spent 9 years becoming the thing that leaves people to die. She would not spend the last shot of it becoming the thing that kills for its own comfort. On the ice below, the man who wanted her dead lifted his head, and she saw his face clearly, and something in her chest that had stayed shut for 9 years came open. "Nobody gets left," she said, so low the microphone barely caught it. Not the boy in front of him, and not, God help her, the man himself. A living colonel could be made to answer. A dead one never would. Then the wind shifted, and everything she had spent 9 years burying came up the hill to meet her, and she rode it down the way Treadway had taught her, felt into the cold river of it, and she did the only thing that would hold every single line at once. "Read the flag on the bay door," she breathed to Chase. "Give me the wind." And the boy she had saved wiped the ice from his eyes and put his glass on the storm and became, for one breath, the spotter she needed. "Full value, left to right," he said. "Steady now, a Calvert again. Call it 3/4 of a mil into it." She held off the pistol in Wesley Prentice's hand. Into the wind she could not see, against everything the world was telling her, and she sent it. The round crossed 1,100 yards of frozen dark in a little more than a second and a half, and it took the pistol out of the colonel's hand in a spray of shattered steel and broke 2 of his fingers and spun him around and put him down on the ice, screaming, disarmed, alive. Alive. A defendant. A living man who would have to sit in a bright room and answer for every name he had ever crossed off a list. Inside the bay, Mose Tibbets put his shaking paper to the microphone, and his old voice went out over every speaker in that building, reading the field message he had signed 9 years ago, reading the truth of the ridge above Sethraz into the burning red eyes of the cameras, and it went out and out into the world, and it could never be called back. They came for the colonel out of the storm, not his men. A woman came for him, 40 or so, in a plain grey coat that she opened now to show the badge that had been turned backward against her chest for 3 days. She had been sent here quietly, weeks ago, to watch a man she could not yet touch, and now she had watched him try to murder an unarmed witness on live cameras, and now she could touch him. She knelt beside Wesley Prentice in the ice and the light, and she said the only words a man like that ever truly hears. "A dead hero is a legend, Colonel," Dina Kendra said. "A live one is a defendant. You should have let her shoot you." They got Reuben Fessler out of the bay gently, with blankets, the way you get a wounded man off a field. He was not a terrorist, and everyone in that building knew it now. He was a brother who had walked 9 years to make the world say his brother's name, and it had said it at last, on every speaker, in an old sergeant's breaking voice. He looked for her as they walked him past, looked up at the dark hill where she still lay in the ice, and he lifted one hand, and she lifted one back. Two people who had carried the same dead boy up the same hill from opposite sides and had finally set him down. Nobody had been left. Not one. Not even the man who had earned it least. She came down off the hill slow, with the rifle across her back and the boy walking close beside her, and the storm was already beginning to break, the ice ticking softer now, a hard, clean cold coming in behind it, and a thin, grey line of dawn showing far off at the edge of the prairie. The two-star general met her at the bottom of the hill. He had been a hostage an hour ago, and he had heard every word that came over those speakers, and he faced her now in the breaking cold, and he did not know what to do with his hands. He was a powerful man who had just learned that the finest shot in the history of his own schoolhouse had been standing at the back of the room for 3 days being called a range widow, and that a man he had pinned medals on was a coward who left boys to die. "Sergeant," he said, "the record on that wall, the shot at Sethraz, that was you, all these years, and the army let them take your name off of it." He shook his head slowly. "How many were yours out there on that ridge? How many of those boys were yours to answer for?" She looked past him at the range coming pale out of the dark, at the field house where a hard sergeant had kept a class of frightened boys safe through the worst night of their lives, at the drill bay where an old man had finally set down a weight he had carried for 9 years, at the young woman named Sava, standing in the door with her rifle, who had learned to read the low grass instead of the flags, at the boy in the dress uniform beside her, breathing, alive, a good man's coat about to become his. All of them, she said, and she found, saying it, that it did not cost her anything at all. They wanted to put her on a stage after that. There was talk of it in the weeks that came, once the roads opened, and the investigators came out, and the story got too big to bury. There was talk of a ceremony, and a correction to the record, and a medal to replace the one they had given the wrong man. She let them correct the record. She stood in a quiet office and watched a clerk type her name onto the line above that number at last, Sergeant First Class, and the call sign Bellwether, and beside it, at her insistence, the name of the man whose coat she wore, Staff Sergeant Eli Treadway. Distinguished for a valor the Army had spent 9 years pretending belonged to someone else. And a third name, added that same day to the true account of the Ridge. No longer a coward, no longer a boy who ran. Specialist Seth Fessler held his ground, did not leave. But she would not stand on the stage. She had never done any of it to be seen, and she was too old to start now. She let them read the citations to an empty room and mail the medals in flat boxes, and the only ceremony she went to was a small one on a cold, clear morning at Blue Stem, when the grass had begun to come back gold and green, when they put a small brass plate at the far end of the firing line out at the edge of the long draw where the wind is honest, and named that firing point for a boy named Wyatt Sisk, who had once carried a stranger a cup of coffee because it was the kind thing to do. Hap Ockley stood at that dedication in his dress uniform, and when it was over, he did not shake her hand. He came to attention in front of her, and he held a salute, a long, slow moment. A hard old sergeant to a sergeant harder than himself, and she returned it, and neither of them said a word, because none were needed. She found Chase Calvert at the end of that morning, standing where he always stood, in front of the record board in the schoolhouse door, looking at a number that finally had the right names beside it. He was quiet now, in a way he had not been the first day. Grief had done to him what it does. It had made him real. She took off the coat. She had worn it 9 years, through every cold country and every empty room, the last warm thing of the best man she had ever known. And she folded it once, the way you fold a thing you love, and she held it out to the boy that man had died to save. He kept you breathing once, she said. It is your turn to hold it now. Chase Calvert took the coat in both hands like it was made of something that could break. He could not speak. He did not have to. There is a rifle in my truck, she said, an old one. It has thrown one true round for every year you have been alive, and it has a few left. Sergeant Major Tibbets will teach you what the coat means, and a girl named Sava will teach you to read the low grass, because she is better at it already than any man on this range. And someday, when some tired soul comes walking up to your firing line in a coat that does not fit, and everyone laughs, you are going to remember what it cost to laugh at the wrong person. She put her hand on his shoulder, once. We hold the line, son. Nobody gets left. That is the whole of it. That is the only thing they can never take off the wall. Then she watched him do the thing she had come all this way to see. She watched Chase Calvert carry that rifle out to the firing line in the gold spring grass and lie down behind it and read the honest prairie wind and send one cold, clean round out across the long draw. And a second and a half later, from all that distance, the steel rang. One bright note, rolling back up the draw like a bell at the far edge of the world. The dead honored the only way the dead are ever truly honored, by the living doing right, the thing they died knowing. She did not stay for the rest. She had a new set of orders in her pocket by then. They had come quietly, the way her orders always came, folded and stamped and signed by someone whose name meant nothing out here. Because the record of the ridge above Sethraz had been corrected now, all of it, and someone reading it closely had noticed a thing at the very bottom of the old order that scrubbed the rescue, a thing that even Wesley Prentice had only ever been handed and told to carry out. The order to leave those 7 boys had come down for a convoy that mattered more than they did, and that convoy had been authorized by an authority above the colonel, a signature blacked out on every copy, a name the army would not explain, and the board did not have the clearance to ask about. Prentice had been the hand. Somebody had signed for the hand, and that somebody had never once been asked why. She looked at the blacked-out line a long time. Then she folded the orders and put them away, and she took the old ghillie down off the peg for the last time, and she walked out to her truck in the honest morning wind. Behind her, on a firing line in Kansas, a boy in a dead man's coat was teaching a girl the whole world had overlooked how to read a wind that lies. Somewhere ahead of her, in some other cold country, a name waited in the dark that no one had ever made answer for. And the woman they had called a range widow, the ghost on the wall, the one who held the line, put the truck in gear and drove out toward the edge of the prairie, unhurried, and already gone. Where is she now? Reading the wind, holding a line somebody else forgot, and leaving no one.